What if your life depended on sleeping on dirt? For medieval peasants, this wasn't extreme. It was Tuesday. No medicine, no heating, no safety. Yet somehow, they made it through every brutal year with tricks passed down in whispers. In the Middle Ages, survival was not granted. It was wrestled, day by day, from a world that gave nothing freely. The seasons didn't mark time. They marked threats. Spring meant flooding and sickness. Summer brought drought and rot. Autumn demanded harvests under collapsing bodies. And winter, long and merciless, was death's favorite tool. There were no weather forecasts, no government aid, no hospitals. The moment the skies shifted, peasants had only their bodies, their wits, and the knowledge buried in the memories of those who came before them. Hunger didn't arrive once a year. It lingered in the corners of every home, sometimes quiet, sometimes violent, but always waiting. A failed crop wasn't a disappointment. It was a sentence. A bad winter didn't mean higher bills. It meant someone wouldn't wake up in the morning. Children learned early that comfort was dangerous. To fall asleep near the hearth meant risking a chimney fire. To drink from the wrong stream meant weeks of fever. A single rotten turnip could poison a family. Life was not about growing. It was about lasting. And lasting required more than strength or faith. It demanded tricks, little acts of genius born from desperation. These weren't tricks you'd find in books. They weren't written, studied, or even explained. They turned clay into insulation, sour milk into medicine, and smoke into armor. They manipulated dirt, air, and time. Their tools were crude, but their methods were anything but. Every little hack carried the weight of generations, refined by suffering, preserved by fear, and sharpened by repetition. And still, it was never enough. There was no year without loss. Every family buried someone. Every child watched a parent wither. Every mother learned to cook without enough food. They didn't live in homes. They endured them. Yet inside these crumbling shelters, something brilliant stirred. A kind of genius that no one ever celebrates because it was never meant to be admired. It was meant to keep people breathing until the next frost. It's a story about medieval survival, about how the poorest and most forgotten people outsmarted hunger, cold, and time itself with nothing but their hands and memory. Because when death stood at the door, they didn't open it. They blocked the cracks with straw, fed the fire with dung, and whispered to their children how to trick the darkness one more night. Let's begin with the first trick, and see how peasants stayed warm without a single piece of firewood. When the wind screamed through wooden planks and frost bit through walls like knives, fire alone wasn't enough. Even the hearth, though sacred, could not heat every corner of a peasant's world. Wood was precious, and forests weren't always near or safe. For many, cutting trees meant risking limbs, lives, or landowner punishment. Gathering branches was backbreaking, and not all wood burned well. Some hissed, some smoked, others refused to catch. So they turned to stone, not for building, but for warmth. After baking bread, the oven held heat long after the flames had vanished. Thick river rocks, tucked deep into that fading chamber, absorbed every ember's final breath. Before bed, they wrapped those stones in wool, rags, or coarse linen, then buried them under straw mattresses or sheep pelts. The heat, trapped inside those silent guardians, radiated slowly into the night, warding off the chill without a single crackle. Children huddled close to where those hidden suns were placed, arms curled around bundles of hay, skin pressed against warmth that never glowed. Parents placed them with care, knowing exactly how far to avoid burns, but close enough to thaw frozen limbs. No words were needed. Everyone in the house could feel the slight comfort, like the ghost of summer buried under the bedding. It wasn't just the rocks. Everything in the room became part of the strategy. Windows were stuffed with moss, cracks patched with mud, and even clothes doubled as insulation. Wool cloaks, once used for travel, became sleeping sacks when nights turned merciless. Furs were layered not for softness, but to trap heat and shield from wind. Straw wasn't scattered. It was arranged with purpose, always thickest where the cold crept in. Families didn't sleep in separate beds, not because they were close, but because space meant danger. Bodies pressed together in long rows, sharing breath, building a single shared furnace with skin and bone. Even animals were brought indoors. Goats tied near the wall, chickens resting in baskets, their warmth no less valuable than wood. And when even that failed, they turned to walls. Some homes had benches built into stone or clay, designed to absorb warmth from ovens on the other side. These warm seats weren't luxury, they were salvation. A child too sick to shiver might be placed there, wrapped in layers, breathing shallow, but alive by dawn. There were no blankets to spare, no spare fuel to burn. Only technique. Survival wasn't won through force, but by mastering materials others would overlook. Rocks became tools, not weapons. Hay became armor. The night was still deadly, but not unbeatable. These tricks weren't told as tales. They were lived, night after night, by people who expected nothing from the world except frost and famine. And every time they made it through another winter morning, they didn't celebrate. They simply began preparing for the next, because the cold never stopped. If warmth was a battle, food was a war with no end. Hunger didn't knock. It seeped into bellies, crept through fields, and carved its way into bone. One failed harvest could mean an empty winter, and winters didn't show mercy. There were no shops, no reserves, and no second chances when the stores ran dry. To survive, peasants had to outthink time itself, not by growing more, but by keeping what little they had from vanishing. Preserving food wasn't science. It was instinct sharpened over centuries of desperation. Every household had secrets buried beneath it, dug deep into the soil, cool, silent, and sacred. These weren't grand structures, but narrow pits and low cellars, hidden behind rough doors or beneath the sleeping straw. Carved from clay or reinforced with stone, they breathed cold into baskets and crocks, stalling rot where heat would have devoured. Inside, the air stayed damp, still, and biting, just enough to stop milk from souring, roots from sprouting, and meat from turning. Cabbage heads hung like ghosts, wrapped in rags or packed in brine. Apples, if they lasted, were laid gently in straw-lined rows, checked each week for the first sign of mold. Potatoes and beets shared space with onions and turnips, never piled too high, always rotated with care. Above ground, sun and moisture spoiled everything within days. But underground, darkness held decay at bay just long enough. Even spoiled foods weren't thrown away. They were transformed, fermented, buried, smoked, or dried. Meat hung over low fires until it blackened. Fish, packed in salt or wrapped in bark, waited for the day nothing else remained. They used everything: ash to dry, vinegar to preserve, even honey to seal. Butter was buried in barrels, milk turned to curds before it could curdle on its own. Animal stomachs acted as bags. Intestines became casings, bones boiled until even the marrow gave up. Nothing was wasted, because waste was death in disguise. Even in the dead of winter, when snow covered paths and silence filled barns, the cellars breathed life. Children sent below with candles and baskets knew they were entering something sacred, a space built not for comfort, but for hope. Each jar, each sack, each bundle represented days stolen back from death's grip. It wasn't just about storing food. It was about controlling time. Peasants didn't know words like microbe or oxidation, but they knew what worked. They could smell when something turned. A single mistake could cost a month of meals, or a child's chance to see spring. Mothers remembered which corners stayed driest. Fathers knew which shelf froze first. Even the wind was read like scripture. East meant mildew. West brought cold. The cellar wasn't just beneath the house. It was beneath their lives, anchoring every decision, every risk, every meal. And when the stores began to vanish, when the jars ran low and the pits grew shallow, no one panicked. They just adapted, turned the last scraps into broth, and stretched crumbs into porridge. It was never enough, but it was something. There were no wardrobes, no spares, no morning decisions about outfits. Clothing wasn't fashion, expression, or luxury. It was shelter sewn by hand. When walls cracked and fires failed, bodies became the last defense against the cold. What someone wore could mean the difference between sleep and frostbite, breath and stillness, movement and collapse. Peasants didn't dress for beauty. They dressed to stay alive, hour by hour. Each layer served a purpose, every seam stitched with survival in mind. The base was always linen, coarse, scratchy, but breathable, absorbing sweat before it froze to skin. Over that came wool, thick and dense, trapping heat like earth traps roots. Nothing was wasted, even the scraps, stitched into patches, liners, and padding for joints. In winter, cloaks became blankets, fastened tight with cords or hand-carved pins. The wind couldn't be stopped, but it could be slowed, forced to crawl through folds of cloth before reaching flesh. Mittens were rare, so sleeves grew long and loose, wrapping fingers when frost made skin crack open. Feet were wrapped in layers, then tucked into crude shoes filled with straw or dried moss, anything to block the damp. Animal fat, lard, and grease were rubbed into boots, cloaks, even hats. The smell was harsh, but the barrier it created could mean survival through freezing sleet or slush. On wet days, hoods were drawn low, and wool caps worn beneath to trap escaping heat from the crown. Faces chapped, lips bled, but the brain stayed warm, and that was what mattered. They knew when to remove layers too. Sweat was deadly. If cloth soaked and the wind caught it, even strong bodies could fall within hours. So they paced themselves, working slowly in deep cold, stripping down when labor demanded breath, layering up again before the chill returned. It was a dance, silent and urgent, learned young and practiced without error. Children wore hand-me-downs patched so many times the original color vanished. Gowns became tunics, then aprons, then rags, then stuffing for shoes. Nothing was thrown away. Wool, too damaged for wear, was spun into rope, felted into padding, or used as insulation between roof beams. Even hair from sheep too old to shear found its place between layers. Sleep didn't come with undressing. It came with bundling. Cloaks wrapped over tunics, tunics over shirts, all under a blanket of animal skins or straw. They slept curled, arms inside sleeves, legs tucked close to conserve warmth. Besides siblings, parents, and sometimes livestock, their clothes became part of the bed itself, holding heat as tightly as arms once did. During summer, everything reversed. Light linen stayed on, but wool hung nearby. Nights could still cut sharp, and wet skin was never safe. Even then, layering remained a tactic, not for comfort, but as armor against unexpected storms or chilled winds through thin walls. Clothing wasn't made for the season. It was made for everything. They feared the cold, yes, but fire came with its own kind of danger. Flames brought warmth, but also risk. Sparks meant disaster, and light meant exposure. During war, bandits followed smoke trails like wolves follow scent. So peasants learned to work with smoke, not as a flame's byproduct, but as a silent shield. What began as necessity evolved into something closer to ritual, a practice honed through trial, habit, and fear. Smoke was everywhere, yet never wasted. It cured meat, hardened cheese, dried herbs, and guarded against insects that ruined grain before it ever reached the table. Low fires smoldered under rafters, their plumes snaking slowly toward thatched ceilings, painting them black over the years. The smell seeped into clothes, into walls, into skin. Not unpleasant, but heavy, ancient, and unmistakable. It told you that inside, someone still fought to survive. Even when food was scarce, peasants smoked what little they had. Rabbits, caught with snares, were hung above coals, drying slowly without ever cooking. Fish, coated in ash and salt, absorbed the smoke's bitterness until rot lost its grip. No roaring fire announced the process, Only a quiet ember bed, tended carefully to avoid detection or disaster. More than food was touched by smoke. Bedding, laid out near the hearth, absorbed its properties too. Lice fled from it, fleas avoided it, and the worst illnesses seemed to retreat under its influence. Herbs were burned in small bundles, sage, wormwood, or yarrow, not for scent, but for protection. The rising cloud, thick with oils, drifted through rooms like a slow-moving spell, warding off what couldn't be seen. Smoke was even used to heal. Boiled tar and singed bark were inhaled by the sick, their lungs opened by acrid breath. Coughing children sat near smoldering leaves, the bitter sting believed to drive illness from the body. No one understood infection, but they knew the air could be poisoned, and somehow smoke kept that poison at bay. They smoked clothes, blankets, even tools. A smoked garment resisted damp and mold longer than one left clean. A wooden bowl, passed through smoke, repelled insects. Even ropes and cords, especially those kept for livestock, were hung near heat to dry and strengthen. The smoke-tightening fibers no knife could cut. In summer, when flies swarmed and sickness spread, the fire never went fully out. It was banked, buried beneath ash, yet alive, waiting, ready to smoke dried herbs or drive pests from sleeping corners. Babies slept near it, cradled in baskets laced with sweet-smelling branches, their air filtered by years of soot. Peasants didn't think of this as special. It wasn't superstition, but inherited wisdom, taught through gestures and repetition. A mother waved a cloth through smoke before feeding her infant. A father ran his hands through smoke before sealing a storage barrel. These weren't rituals. They were defenses, quiet, persistent, invisible. There was no glory in it, no celebration when it worked, just another breath, another night survived, another chance to see the morning. Inside most peasant homes, space was not measured in feet. It was counted in breaths. A single-room structure held an entire family's life, from sleep to labor, from birth to death, with barely enough room to stretch. There were no hallways, no privacy, no separation between night and day. As children grew and livestock multiplied, the walls remained the same, but need kept expanding. So they built sideways, not with grandeur, but with grit. Lean-tos, cobbled together from broken branches, salvaged cloth, and sun-dried mud, appeared like afterthoughts clinging to the sides of homes. They weren't beautiful. They sagged, tilted, groaned with the weight of every storm. But they stood. And that was enough. One might hold tools too dangerous or valuable for the open yard. Another kept chickens warm when the air turned bitter and sharp. Some were used as sleeping quarters for older sons or ailing grandparents, their only comfort a dry place and some protection from the wind. These structures weren't built to last decades. They were made to survive the week, the month, the coming winter. Roofing was whatever could be found. Straw, moss, bark stripped from trees during long walks through frozen woods. Gaps were sealed with dung, clay, or flattened cloth soaked in oil or fat. In summer, the heat trapped inside could grow unbearable. In winter, it might be the only corner of the world where breath didn't freeze. Nothing about these additions was stable. Rain could collapse them, snow might cave them in, and animals often tried to make them their own. Yet families repaired them without complaint, hammering stakes back into thawing ground, weaving new branches where old ones snapped, patching leaks with more of whatever the earth offered that season. Children played in them when the sun returned, and days felt forgiving. Mothers dried herbs along their walls, stringing bundles from hooks that once held animal skins. Fathers carved spoons, sharpened tools, or mended baskets in corners lit only by thin cracks in the walls. Each lean-to became part workshop, part refuge, an extension of a home that never grew but somehow always held more. Sometimes visitors were received there, neighbors who needed help, travelers too poor for inns, or cousins fleeing hunger from nearby villages. The lean-to wasn't offered with pride, but it wasn't withheld either. It was enough to share a roof, however thin, and a floor, however damp. Even dying often happened there, not from cruelty, but because warmth and space inside the main home had to be saved for the living. A last breath might rise beneath a ceiling made from sticks and sewn together rags, while a candle sputtered in a dish of oil beside the body. Still, the lean-to never became a symbol of defeat. It represented something far stronger, the refusal to surrender, the stubborn will to make room for life, even when life offered no room at all. No blueprints existed, no standard shape or size. They grew like vines from necessity, guided only by hands that had no choice. And when the structure collapsed completely, crushed under time or weather, another would be built in its place, not as improvement, but as continuation. Food didn't rot by accident. It rotted because time never waited. The moment it was pulled from soil or slaughtered in the yard, the clock began ticking. In summer, spoilage came like a flood, fast and relentless, stripping away what had taken months to grow. In winter, freezing air preserved what little remained, but only if the cold lasted. So peasants turned to something older than memory, something strange and invisible, the power of fermentation. This wasn't about taste. It had nothing to do with flavor, pleasure, or satisfaction. It was survival through transformation, forcing nature to shift direction before destruction arrived. Bread dough left too long became sour and sharp. Milk forgotten beside a hearth turned thick and biting. Cabbage, pressed and salted, wept brine into barrels and dark jars. And somehow, each change wasn't decay, it was rebirth. They didn't know words like bacteria or yeast, but they saw what worked. A bubbling pot wasn't thrown away. It was stirred, watched, and tasted with cautious reverence. A sour smell didn't always mean danger. Sometimes it meant safety, the signal that the food had crossed into something new, something that wouldn't vanish tomorrow. Even spoiled beer could be strained, thickened, sweetened with herbs, and drunk before fever returned. Fermented porridge sat in corners of kitchens, half covered with cloths weighed down by smooth stones. Leftovers from meals were sometimes scraped into the same pot, creating something between stew, gruel, and medicine. Children learned early that strange textures didn't mean rejection, they meant nourishment. Cold mornings began with scoops of sour mash, warmed over fading embers and swallowed without comment. Cabbage was sliced with knives handed down from grandmothers, packed tight into barrels with bare fists, salt rubbed in until knuckles bled. The mix was stamped, sealed, and left to bubble quietly in cellars where rats couldn't reach. After weeks, it came out soft, pungent, and full of life-giving acid. That sharpness didn't repel. It comforted, a reminder that food could last longer than fear. Milk, if curdled, was not poured out. It was pressed into soft clumps, then drained and dried until it could be stored or spread. The edges turned hard, the inside stayed creamy, and in desperate months, even the sour crust was eaten. Nothing was wasted, because waste was a luxury only the rich could afford. Some used wild apples, fallen and bruised, left to ferment naturally in barrels or bowls. The liquid drawn from them was cloudy, acidic, and alive, enough to clean wounds, fight illness, or flavor boiled roots that had gone tasteless. The peasants didn't call it cider. It had no name, just use. Meat, if too far gone to dry or salt, could be submerged in fat or wine lees, sealed in clay, or layered in pungent herbs that dulled both smell and taste. It wasn't trusted, but it was eaten, and often saved lives. Stomach aches were common, but starvation was worse. Even failure taught them something. When a barrel bloated too fast or a lid popped from gas, they marked the timing. They adjusted salt, waited longer, stirred less. Knowledge was built on mistakes, recorded in calloused fingers and quiet glances, not parchment. Fermentation wasn't art. It was defiance, a refusal to let nature reclaim what had been earned through sweat. Each sour jar, each bubbling crock, each strange-smelling pot was a small rebellion against loss. And in that battle, even rot became an ally. Water didn't flow endlessly. It was hunted, hoarded, and feared. Clean drops were rarer than bread, harder to keep than meat, and far more dangerous when tainted. For peasants, thirst wasn't quenched with ease. It was negotiated, tested, and often betrayed. A single sip could cure, but just as easily, it could kill. Rain was both a curse and salvation. When it poured, paths vanished under sludge and roofs wept through holes no hand could fix. But when the air dried out and wells sank low, peasants begged for that same rain with open hands and cracked lips. So they caught it, not with tools, but with patience and invention. Thatched roofs weren't only for covering, they were collection systems. Slanted carefully, they channeled droplets into wooden gutters or hollowed branches, which fed barrels made from stitched planks sealed with pitch. When storms came, children were sent to adjust rags, fix blockages, or shift lids to prevent overflow. Every splash into a waiting bucket was a tiny victory against coming drought. Stored rainwater was precious, never wasted on washing, rarely used for cooking. It was filtered first, passed through cloth woven from flax or old garments, folded thick to catch crawling things and wind-blown dust. The cleanest liquid still wasn't trusted. Herbs were added: mint, sage, thyme, not for flavor, but for their invisible power to push away illness. When rain stopped falling and barrels stood empty, they turned to the ground. Wells were everywhere, dug deep, lined with stone, covered against light. But not all were safe. A spoiled well didn't announce itself. It whispered through stomach cramps and the stillness of livestock. Peasants tested water the way they tested people, with suspicion, slow sips, and observation. Some dropped silver coins into buckets, hoping purity would reveal itself through brightness. Others placed cut onions nearby, believing they'd absorb the rot before it reached the mouth. It wasn't science. It was survival wrapped in habit. And often, it worked well enough to last another week. When wells ran dry, or poison lingered too long, they created trick solutions. Shallow pits were dug in fields, lined with sand, gravel, and ash. Slow filters that gathered morning dew or redirected groundwater toward containers buried nearby. It wasn't fast, but it worked. A handful of cups a day could mean one less funeral that week. It was stirred with wooden spoons, boiled when firewood allowed, left in sunlight for hours when nothing else could be done. Even then, no one drank deeply unless they had to. Thirst was endured longer than hunger, because the wrong drink ended everything. Mothers whispered to children to avoid puddles, streams, or snow unless told otherwise. Fathers tested ice before melting it, checking color, scent, and origin. The risks weren't dramatic, they were quiet. A stomach turned. A fever arrived. A voice faded after days without strength. In summer, water kept breath inside lungs. In winter, it shattered fingers left wet too long. And in every season, it remained untamed, needed but never owned. The rain came when it wanted. The well held what it could. The rest depended on wisdom, memory, and caution sharpened by loss. They didn't write books, leave monuments, or carve names into stone. Their lives passed in silence, undocumented, unrecorded, and rarely remembered. Yet within their huts, beneath their patched roofs and cracked walls, brilliance unfolded in forms the world no longer sees. Medieval peasants didn't invent machines or draft theories. They created solutions with nothing. Each survival trick was born not from comfort or leisure, but from the quiet urgency of staying alive. They didn't call themselves clever, but their actions told a different story, one of adaptation, endurance, and unacknowledged mastery over hardship. There were no second chances, no experiments with failure, no safety nets beneath them. A mistake in salting meat, a crack in the roof, a delay in boiling water, these were not inconveniences. They were punishments paid in illness, hunger, or death. So they learned from pain, adjusted through grief, and taught with hands instead of words. Their intelligence wasn't abstract. It lived in muscle memory, in how they held a knife, where they placed a stone, when they stepped outside, and when they stayed hidden. The rhythm of their year wasn't marked by holidays or plans. It was mapped by the sun's angle, the soil's firmness, the sound of birds arriving too early or too late. Modern minds often confuse simplicity with ignorance. But survival without tools, time, or knowledge systems demands a different kind of brilliance, one that comes from instinct, not instruction. They couldn't read texts, but they memorized the language of weather. They asked only to last. One more night, one more frost, one more harvest that didn't fail. And through that narrow goal, they birthed something extraordinary. A system of living shaped by constraints, strengthened by loss, and refined through generations of watching, trying, and passing on what worked. These were not tricks to impress. They were choices made in darkness, when no help was coming and no miracle would arrive. They created warmth without wood, food without abundance, space without wealth, and health without medicine, all through knowledge that died quietly when no one asked how it was done. What they built wasn't just survival. It was genius forged in fire, famine, and fear. And though their names have faded, their wisdom lingers, in cellars still cool, in fermented food still eaten, in walls still insulated with straw, and in the quiet resilience passed down without ceremony. They did not live long, but they lived deeply, alert to danger, attuned to change, and awake to the cost of forgetting. And when their children slept safely, however briefly, it meant their work had succeeded. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.